Hi.
There we are. Hello, Alexa.
Hello in this digital space, our favorite.
I know. 11 months in, I wouldn't want anything different.
I'm super excited to join you for this chat today because we've talked about this many times. We both are part of many, many communities that this is all they talk about is how do you invest in underrepresented and underestimated people?
And I think more than just we talk about this in the communities, you and I sort of have this ongoing discussion about this. And we come from kind of different perspectives. Well, everyone comes from a different perspective, but we also overlap on a lot of things. So I think maybe can you just share a little bit about your background and then share about sort of how we're thinking about this term underestimated founders, just for folks who either aren't familiar with that word or just want to see more how we're trying to define it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have had sort of an eclectic background. I started my career in nonprofit finance, moved to philanthropy, and then started working in tech. I had a period of time when I was in philanthropy where I started to do experimental sort of asset allocation, so impact investments, and I got involved in an angel investing group. And that's how I sort of kind of saw the world of tech investing and how much the types of incredible founders and leaders that I was supporting in the nonprofit world would not be able to be supported in the for-profit world, especially in the startup space, even though some of their solutions are just as novel. So I've been at Google for a couple of years. I've been an angel investor for a couple of years. I focus on city infrastructure and underlying systems of business. So sort of the unsexy parts of how cities run. And throughout my career, I've been able to work with incredible leaders, as I've said. I've sat on boards, and I've also seen some really interesting news, right, in the startup industry and in the tech industry around who gets funding. So I think for today, what we're talking about when we say underestimated, which is a term that Arlen Hamilton uses, kind of to be a little bit different from underrepresented or some of the other terms that are a little bit more negative, like to the person, like, oh, you couldn't get this, or you were like, and I think it's a little bit more affirming that everybody, no matter where you come from, has skills that make them an incredible leader and make them solutions oriented, but only some people are able to be seen as leaders and are able to be backed and invested in and supported by people who traditionally have the money to support. So I think for today, we're talking about women, queer people, trans people, disabled people, people of color, people outside of the US. And I think even probably for this discussion, people who aren't located on the coasts. And I say that as somebody sitting in San Francisco, but I invest, as you know, in Latin America with you, and also, and I'm starting to look at the Midwest. And so people who aren't in traditional areas or have a traditional background that has been heavily invested in the past.
Right. And I mean, I would also add to that, I mean, people sort of outside the most common age range of 25 to 35, that sort of thing, also would fall into that category of basically an underestimated founder. I think that one thing that's important to just sort of state at the outset for anyone who's these kind of talks about underestimated founders, about investing in women, investing in people of color, draw sort of typically two types of audience members, right? One type who is like, singing in the choir, like knows it and wants to be there and learn more, or, wants to participate or offer something. And then the other type of person who really is new to this for the first time. So for folks who are new to this for the first time, I think it's just helpful just to set the stage briefly and to just explain that, what we are talking about is not an effing charity. That's a line from Jessie Draper. She's, fourth generation VC in LA, runs Halogen Ventures, which invests in female founders. And she wrote I think it was a Medium post a year ago saying, investing in women is not an effing charity. And this is a reality that people like you and me who are investing in underestimated founders are fighting against every single day, is trying to make this clear, right? Like we now have 10 years of data, many different sources, all of them widely reputable, saying that investing in women, in people of color, in mixed teams, in all female teams, in solo female founders, pick your variant, right, is better for the bottom line. And again, you can pick your variant there in terms of, revenue, in terms of higher valuations at exit, in terms of faster exits, right? So we have lots of this data, and yet there is still this wide misconception that it literally is a social impact thing. And I'm, at my heart, I was a social entrepreneur before I got into tech. I had a small nonprofit out in East Africa. I started at Twitter with the mission of basically building up Twitter's social impact stuff early on. So I love social impact, but this is not that.
Yeah. And I think, social impact in the space of tech or in the space of finance, really, because I think that's where I would put it, is seen as a bad thing because it's seen as a risk.
Yes.
And as asset allocators, one of the main things, if we're giving investment advice, we're investing on behalf of LPs or other people, is that we have to be a fiduciary. And I think traditionally in this industry, betting on people who don't have a lot of capital of their own is seen as a risk. And so when you just look at that and you don't look at sort of all the context around it, and sort of like, yeah, exactly what you said, the data points that women and people of color do better at, with starting companies, but also as asset allocators. So that's a very important thing.
And in different types of assets, we're talking about hedge funds, PE, VC, yeah.
Exactly. And that the sort of structure of success in the startup world is different than, say, if I were going to, start a bank or something like that. Like that, it's really, really different with sort of how your startup capital relates to how far you can go. And like social capital is really important. Social capital helps people become unicorns. So I think a lot of the understanding about who is a risk and who isn't is steeped in racism. So I'm just going to leave that there. You can not agree with me or whatever. But also I think it's really kind of a moot point at this point. Like it does not matter if people have a huge friends and family round or not. Is their idea timely? Are they the person to do it? And can you as an investor help resource them to make sure that they're successful? And that's resourcing with money, that's resourcing with your network, your skills. Do you have time to get in there and be their marketer for 3 months? So I think we have to look at investing from a holistic view and be a little bit innovative with the industry.
Right. I mean, I think that there's also a concept here which goes back. It's Zoom.
Oh no.
Hi, there's like children. So, I mean, whatever. So I think there is also a concept here that I did want to circle back on in terms of the actual realities of why we do this. And I feel like I read this somewhere of why we invest in underestimated founders and why that actually is better for the bottom line in terms of returns, right? And this is, of course, getting back to this idea that in venture, which is what we're primarily talking about, you're looking for these outsized returns. So you're looking for oftentimes contrarian bets, right? And so what has happened now that we have a venture industry, at least in the US, that is a little bit old now, 50 years or something, is that we have developed a pattern of investing in, our coastal coder bros, who are typically these single white dudes who, I believe in, was it in Peter Thiel's, but in the 0 to 1 book, is said, there's a mention that, one of an ideal founder is kind of a single guy who can sleep on his mattress, not have to pay rent and just focus on his startup, right? And so we've done that model a lot. We've invested over and over and over in that model. And so what's happening now is that we're just fishing in the sludge by continuing.
It's pattern matching. Yeah. And it's pattern matching that, in my mind, for a while worked because it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was like, okay, this guy reminds us of Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe he's non-neurotypical. He doesn't have many friends. He's just going to spend all his time coding, and that's what we want. And I'm going to get all my buddies to invest in him because they missed on Zuckerberg and now they want to get in on a similar founder. Yep. So there was all this baked in bias that I think a lot of people were saying, well, you know, we have X data points, but the data points themselves were biased. You know, it's like, if you're only looking for this type of founder and you only think this type of founder can be successful, guess what? You're going to make him successful. You know what I mean? And what I think we're seeing is a lot of founders, like the founder of WeWork, we're seeing people who did get a huge amount of capital invested early on, who did fit that early pattern that I think, I'll tell you why, but I actually think that there's a lot in there that we should be betting on that we're not. But, you know, who fit that pattern, who then later on had misconduct suits and all sorts of problems when their companies grew because their investors and their backers weren't calling them on their stuff and maybe weren't looking at them as whole people, but we're just saying, okay, what can you do for me? We're going to forgive all this other stuff because maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe you'll be rich enough to pay it off when you're done. And like, that's not good for the industry either. And you know, the way I invest, and I think about investing as an angel, and if I start my fund, is I think outlying founders are the way to go. But I kind of, you know, I think when they were looking at Zuckerberg and really, you know, when Microsoft got started, when Google got started, it was a lot of individuals who created something that they didn't have in society. Mm-hmm. Maybe they were a little bit different from your typical person in the way that they thought. And I think those are the sorts of founders we should bet on. Like, I like betting on people who are a little bit weird, are a little bit creative, maybe taught themselves how to code, or are solving a problem that other people have tried to solve, but other people didn't have the lived experience of. So I do think we should, you know, look for those kinds of founders. But I think early on, investors were kind of missing the mark with what they were trying to pattern match. I think they were like, okay, white man, but they were missing like all this other stuff that is what started the tech industry. Like, it was a bunch of weird people who couldn't get jobs other places because they were so weird and they just wanted to create stuff. They weren't disciplined. They were working out of garages. And I like, those are the types of people I still look for. I'm like, who's doing something different? It doesn't care about society, you know?
Absolutely. And it's this whole idea that, you know, I mean, I just, in so much of my investing is basically consumer and then fintech, which I sort of consider part of consumer, but consumer and fintech and enterprise to some extent are all about, in my view, vertical communities these days, right? And so what is more important to a vertical community than making sure that you have different types of people creating those communities, right? And so, I mean, just yesterday, this is an example, I saw I don't even remember the name of the company, but they just announced a $3.5 million funding in terms of a SaaS productivity thing for families, right? And this is the second one I've seen lately. Another one, Avni Patel Thompson, who is from YC, has one called Milo also, right? And this is just a perfect example of someone saying, hey, I'm a parent and our, you know, logistics are completely effed up and I can't manage my life and we need to fix this, right? And so someone going in and saying, this is actually a community of people who has a real need, right? But the problem is there hasn't been a startup parent who has had that thought before or that drive before to do it, right? So you have a new community being started and then a new community, you know, being essentially, well, sorry, a new community not being started, a new community now being addressed because it's a different type of founder. But what you have to do in order to make sure that person gets funding is you have to have different types of investors in the room. And this is the whole thing. I mean, Latasha Morrison, this wonderful activist and author, says that, if you don't have a brain, you don't have bias. And so that's when you kind of get back to this idea that we all come with biases. Me being raised in Berkeley, California by two hippies, I think certain things about Republicans and, I maybe don't like meat or whatever it is, right? And so that means that when I'm in a pitch meeting, I am going to maybe have certain reactions when someone comes in with some, like GMO cow product, for example, right? And that's just a bias. And it's good for me to know my biases and to work on my biases. That's essential. But it's also just a reality that you need people with different perspectives in the room to identify different opportunities.
Yeah, that was actually the thing that made me understand that I needed to become an investor. As I said, I started to get involved in an angel group when I was still working in philanthropy. And I remember it was my first or second pitch meeting. I was the only woman there, and I was the only Black person there. And I think everyone else, there were white men and maybe one or two Asian men on the investor side. And we had about 5 people come pitch, and one of the women was a woman of color. She was an Asian woman. And I was there to learn, so I didn't ask many questions, and I was taking notes. And I just remember that when she walked in the room, the people on both sides of me bristled. They were like, oh God, like, what is she about to talk about? And I could feel it there. And I'm sure there were audible sighs of like, oh God, like, we're not going to be able to invest in this. It was almost like they were expecting her to annoy them.
Yeah.
And I just had this like hot anger seep into my spirit. And, it was visceral because I have had many, many, many experiences, and we've talked about this, of being underestimated in rooms, being underestimated in different situations at work, and knowing that I was being underestimated and having to do the work of calming myself down and showing up, making sure I sounded smart, and doing extra work and sending notes to everybody and bringing energy into the room and holding space. And she could feel it, and I saw her do all of those things. And she got asked harder questions than the men. She got asked, it was an early seed angel group. So a lot of the dudes who came in there just had a concept and like a loose PowerPoint. You know what I mean? And she had traction in the market. She had tested different things out. She had a prototype that she brought with her. She was ready. She was prepared, and she had evidence of how impactful and successful her company could be. And they just tried to tear her apart. And so I had a discussion with them after, and the reason I was part of this group actually was to help them on their impact investing metrics, oddly enough. And I just took it as a segue. I said, okay, you can say that you care about impact, you can say that you care about social justice, but really all of this stuff starts with how you treat people. And it was a hard conversation. They didn't really get what I was talking about. And I had to just say, you guys asked her harder questions. I wrote them down. Here's who asked so-and-so. And I had to just show them the receipts, which also work. I'm not being paid as a DEI person. I shouldn't have to do that. But, after that, I was 100% long on being an investor. I said, I have to be in the room because I'm going to see things that other people don't see. And that's an advantage.
Was she a solo female founder?
She was a solo founder. Yeah.
Okay. So then first off, I mean, there's fascinating data on, what types of questions women get in pitches. Everyone should look at my friend Dana Kahn's TED Talk. She's a professor at London Business School, and she has a great TED Talk about this, right? About exactly why women what the types of questions women receive in startup pitch meetings and why they are basically biased towards more negative, right? So women have to defend themselves constantly. But one of the things that's really interested me in the last few months, and part of this is, so for my next book, I'm writing a book on female founders and female funders with one of my friends, Sophia Bentz, who's a VC at Cherry Ventures. She was in Europe. She was early Spotify. And one of the things we've been really looking at is just the crazy data into solo female founders and all female teams. So, you know, a lot of times when you see data about funding women, it's mixed in terms of mixed teams, right? So you're looking at how funding has changed to teams that have at least one female founder, right? And the reality is that over the last 10 years, that has gone up. But what is so horrible is that literally we are at the same number we were 12 years ago when it comes to funding all female founders and solo female teams. Sorry, all female teams or solo female founders. And so one of the interesting reasons for this, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons to unpack it, but one of them is just this, you know, getting back to pattern matching, this idea that if there's just one person, that person has to be really extraordinary, especially if they're not a solo tech founder, right? And so who do we think of as extraordinary? And we just go back to, you know, the things that have happened before, and we just want to see a version of that again. And it's devastating to see the results of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm backing one solo female founder and one male founder, single male founder right now, and they're just they're at vastly different places in their company, but the male founder that I'm backing is XYC. And I can just tell in our first couple of meetings, I asked everybody very similar questions. I asked them who their other investors are, what will happen if this company fails right now, what would happen if this happened in the market. Like I asked all kinds of questions. And I could tell in our first meeting that he was like, oh, like no one's ever asked me this before. I can find that for you.
Right.
And I asked the same question.
I'm a guy and I'm XYC. Yeah. Like
and we actually had a conversation about that. And I was like, why do you think no one's asked you this before? You should know this. This is rigor. And so you should know this at this point in your company, because I'm not going to put you in front of, I'm just an angel investor, and I'm going to put you in front of larger investors than me, than what I have checks for, but I'm not going to do that and put my name behind you unless you're ready. And he was like, okay. And he came back to me and he was totally ready, which is why I invested in him. But the female founder, she had decks of data, testimonials, customer testimonials, investor testimonials. She sends me updates probably weekly if she can. The male founder, he's a very different person. They're very different personalities. He's introverted, she's extroverted, but I hear from him maybe every 2 months. But I think it's because, and I wouldn't have backed them unless I believed in obviously both of their companies and their abilities to make those successful. But, you know, it's definitely an indicator of a lot of men I've seen in the industry be a little bit more lax in their approach because they've been able to be. And then, and then women have to overcompensate. One thing I want to talk about is, and maybe you can start us off by talking about like what happened in 2020 and like why we wanted to have this conversation today. And then I have a segue from that.
I mean, what happened in 2020 is just everything went to shit basically, but I don't know if, honestly, it wasn't that much better before. I mean, I'm happy that there are words in, newspapers and online sources being devoted to this problem and to the fact that, funding to women and people of color is lower than ever before. But the reality is it shouldn't be surprising to anyone at all, right? I mean, 2020 was a year that on a global level was worse for women and people of color and anyone we consider sort of underestimated in terms of founders. And so, they were going to have a harder time raising. There's so many different reasons for this. One of my favorite comes from, I think it was Jen from January Ventures, who made a comment really early on in the pandemic in an article talking about how when investors talk about sort of shrinking back into their existing networks, the effect that has on things. And I'm always reminded by the fact that, when I joined Clubhouse sometime early in the pandemic, the reason I, raised my hand and got on stage for the first time was because there was a male investor from London saying that he didn't know of anyone who ever invested via Zoom and didn't believe that it could happen. And, I'm from California. I've been living in Latin America for 10 years. My fund is based in Latin America. Latin America is a big place with a lot of countries. And certainly I also do angel investing around the globe. And so I've definitely invested via Zoom. And I felt like it was such a sort of privileged, but just myopic, but just weird perspective that I had to sort of get up on stage. And it's so funny just what a difference a year has made in terms of the way people are thinking. There has been an opening up, obviously not enough of an opening up because the funding numbers are so horrible. One thing I do want to, well, you talk now. Tell me your response to that,
right,
because I really want to make sure we talk about the pipeline problem.
Yeah, okay, exactly. I was gonna say.
The pipeline problem.
There's so much we could talk about. Oh God. And then you brought up Clubhouse, which is, as you know, I've been on Clubhouse also since very early on, and it's changed a lot since we both joined. That's a whole thing. But the pipeline problem. All right. So one thing that happened in 2020 is that there was a surge in political activity around the Black Lives Matter movement. And, it's not the first time, and obviously these are not new issues that are being brought up, but the way that at least I saw the tech industry and the VC industry respond was new. And, I think what I saw was a lot of people trying to throw some quick money at the problem and start to talk about things they had never even thought about before, and bring people of color onto their team real quick to make them seem diverse. And as we've moved in, as that started to happen, people were making all these announcements. And then we moved into 2021, I'm starting to see that taper off. And one of the things I've talked to you about is my conversations with VC funds. I actually had probably close to 300 VC chats last year. And I should probably put it into a book, and it's just called VC Chats. And many of the people I talked to, and they were informational interviews, conversations about maybe getting involved as a venture partner at some of these funds. And so not a full-time person, but somebody who co-invests with the funds. Maybe in the future becoming an associate or a principal there. So, the conversations ranged from sort of general to specific about my background and my experience as a potential candidate. And I shouldn't have been shocked, but I kind of was in many instances where I had conversations with investors who worked on all male white investor teams, and maybe there were people who weren't cis male at the firm, but they weren't in investing roles, and had very odd questions posed to me. So one of the questions was, how would you feel being the only person of color and the only woman on our investing team? Another question.
Great. I would feel great.
Yeah, other questions I got were around, would you be comfortable, but it sort of sounded like this. We're thinking about diversity every day. We know we have to get better. And if we brought you onto the team, we would love for you to spearhead some of our DEI initiatives.
Yep, totally. You're not just an investor, you're a champion, a cheerleader, a whatever.
Yeah, and actually, candidly, I'm not a diversity investor. I have invested in people of color. I'm open to investing in people who aren't people of color. Obviously, I don't just invest in women. I have a perspective as a queer Black woman of color. and also I have a perspective that I think is important as an American, because there are things that are different here that are, different from other countries. And so I think all of those things I bring to my investment process, but I actually don't have an impact fund. I'm not an impact investor. And so it's been really hard to
But you're Black.
I right. It's been really hard to work in this industry and see how I'm pigeonholed. And luckily, I will say that the current team I'm working on at Google, like one of the reasons I actually started a new job this Monday at Google. And one of the reasons I chose the team and I chose my boss is because from the get-go, he treated me like a person and not like a diversity play or someone who he was bringing me on because I could add some color or some, exotic sort of perspective to the team. Like I'm working on a technical team, I'm working on technical problems, and it's important that I'm a person of color. I'm seen, for that. It's not a colorblind environment, but that's not why I'm there, And I think in the venture sector, I've talked to many Black women specifically who've tried to get into venture and weren't seen as investors. So they had to start their own funds. They had to just give themselves a shot. And I think in many ways, I've started to do that myself. I'm starting a syndicate soon. I've angel invested on my own and kind of, I'm not sure if the traditional go to college, go to grad school, get a job as an associate, grow into a partner track is in my future. And I think that's okay. But I think the industry as a whole really needs to stop putting the onus on people of color and women to teach them what they need to learn. And really, they just need to make space and put people on and give people opportunities to shine, because there's not a pipeline problem. People are out there. People are highly skilled. If you look at the data, women of color, specifically Black women, are some of the highest educated people in the US. The skills are there. The opportunities are not. So
I mean, so about a year ago when I was an angel investor, mostly in Silicon Valley, and then a year ago I joined a fund, Magma Partners, which does pre-seed and seed in LATAM. You're an LP, and we launched Brava, which is the first sort of initiative of its kind to fund female founders across LATAM. And at the time, we had a lot of pushback from LPs about how we were going to clarify the nature of the initiative, right? And one of the concerns was, nobody wanted it to sound like there was some sort of quota being met in terms of the number of women we would invest in, because that, in some LPs' minds, meant that, we would be somehow, ignoring the best companies to meet some quota, right? Which obviously gets back to this constant idea that there is a pipeline problem. And I think what is so interesting for me, I'm someone that, lives in this world and have felt for years strongly that there's no pipeline problem, but it's just been so interesting to watch it so clearly just in 1 year of this fund. So we said, look, we want to do 20 female founders, right, in the next 3 years. We're a year in and we already have 15, right? And sometimes people are asking me, has that been hard to find? And it's like literally a joke. It's like, it's not hard at all to find. It's like you put a flag down and you say, we want to invest in women in LATAM or women from LATAM. And all of a sudden you get all the good ones pitching you, and then you have way too many deals. And it's just, it's incredible. And we know the data, right? The data says that a female investor, and thus by extension, any fund focused on women that has a female investor is up to 3 times more likely to invest in a female founder. And, that's the data we know. And we can assume that there is similar data when it comes to investors who are people of color, investing in people of color, things like that. But it's just so crazy. I mean, the ecosystem is there. You just have to be a part of it somehow, right? And so it's very hard to be a coastal coder turned VC bro and not be a part of any of that, and then complain that there's no pipeline. Because you're just wrong.
I think you hit the nail on the head that There is going to be some sort of pushback, I think. I don't think we've seen it yet, because, and I've seen it in other industries where there's, there's a constant debate happening about things like affirmative action and things like
Mhm.
that. Um, it's easy to say you're treating these people special when there's a spotlight on people
Mhm.
who haven't historically had it. But really, the other side of that is there's a perception that it's moving the spotlight away from people who've historically had it.
Mhm.
And I mean, this has happened over and over again in history. When women were trying to win the right to vote, men were like, well, no, but if women start to vote and have positions of power, where does that leave men? Oh God, we're
Yeah.
scared. And I think the best approach for someone who's a traditional investor and feels like they're losing their power is to empower others. That's the
Mhm.
best approach. Because if you're
Mhm.
taking any other approach, if you're taking an extractive approach and you're trying to find underrepresented people to teach you something and to keep empowering you and to give you something, they're going to sense that and they're going to run away and make their own thing, and you will
Yeah.
be left out of the
Yeah.
conversation. Like, let's
Yeah.
just be honest.
Yeah.
And so, any way you cut it, if we want to look at demographic changes, if we want to look at younger consumers who are more socially aware and more, um, kind of only willing to work with companies and buy from companies that they feel like are in line with their values. Any way you cut it, if you're a traditional investor who does not believe in diversity, thinks that it's, a myth or it's a trend, um, then yeah, you might have a reason to be a little bit afraid, because that means that you're not being the strongest investor you can be, because
Mhm.
you're cutting yourself off
Mhm.
from opportunities that will be really successful regardless of if
Mhm.
you're there or not.
Yeah.
um
Right.
yeah,
Right.
so I do think there's a fear, and yeah, all I can say, and I have many friends that I think have this fear and are more traditional, and I'm like, just like, tell me about what you're doing, be a mentor, like, just show up as a person. Like, you don't have to show up as, you're a white man, I'm a black woman, and like, let me formalize some nonsense. Like, what knowledge do you have as an investor? Share that with people of color, share that with underrepresented people. Start to go to conferences where you know that that's going to be a focus, and just
Mhm.
try to learn something. Like, that's,
Yeah.
like, it's kind of simple, but I think people
Yeah.
overcomplicate it because of their egos, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to end on sort of one thing I would recommend people want to do, especially from people should do from the investor side, and then I'll point it to you or turn it to you, is just, yeah, this idea that if you're an investor and you want better deal flow in general, you want to see deals you haven't seen before, you need to start diversifying the types of communities and networks you are a part of, both from a friend perspective and a professional network perspective, because this is all a relationship business.
Mhm.
And if you don't have natural connections with people from different walks of life, you will be very unlikely to end up funding people from other walks of life.
Right. Absolutely. And I'll say, um, like I said, like, I'm a black queer woman. I'm also neurodiverse. I think what I always say to people is diversity includes white men. Diversity
Mm.
includes everybody. There's not a scarcity issue in the knowledge people can bring to a conversation. Like, more
Mhm.
is just more. More doesn't mean less for one person all the
Mm.
time. So sometimes it does mean stepping down from a board if you're on 15. That's fine.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does mean sharing power, but it doesn't mean that you are written out of history and that you
No.
don't have a place. So I would say, understand that. I would say, if you're an LP, back underrepresented allocators, because they do know things that you don't know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
augment their knowledge with what you do know. and
Yep.
augment their networks with who you do have in your network and who's
Mhm.
maybe more blue chip or more institutional.
Mhm.
Work together. I think that's my one takeaway is work together. If you want to invest in me when I start my fund, let me know. I'm on
Do it.
LinkedIn.
Do
It's not
it.
going to be at least for another year, but yeah, I'm here for future LPs. So
Do it. Thanks,
yeah.
guys.
Thanks everybody.
Cool. Awesome.